When I married Thomas Whitaker at 58, I genuinely believed I possessed an intrinsic understanding of how families, in their intricate and often baffling dynamics, truly functioned. After 32 years spent navigating the turbulent waters of adolescent minds as a high school counselor in rural Vermont, I had witnessed nearly every conceivable familial fracture. I had seen legacies and minor heirlooms ignite bitter, lifelong feuds between siblings. I had observed countless adult children, fiercely territorial, treat new spouses as interlopers, resented for merely existing. I prided myself on my ability to detect the nascent tremors, the subtle warning signs that promise seismic shifts. My confidence, I would soon discover, was a fragile thing. I was profoundly wrong. Thomas was 72 when we exchanged vows, a widower of 5 years whose quiet strength and gentle demeanor had drawn me in. He had retired from a regional chain of hardware stores, a small empire he'd forged from scratch through sheer grit and unwavering principle. He was methodical, deliberate, the kind of man who still penned heartfelt thank-you notes by hand, his cursive neat and legible. His presence was a grounding force, a comforting anchor in a world that often felt adrift. He lived in a magnificent cedar-shingled house, perched majestically on a rise overlooking Blackwater Point in coastal Maine. It was the kind of place where the mornings unfurled with the crisp, clean scent of salt and pine, where the air carried the distant, mournful cry of gulls, and evenings dissolved into the rhythmic, soothing chime of buoy bells drifting across the harbor. Fog often rolled in from the sea, softening the sharp edges of the world, creating a cocoon of quiet. It was, I believed, a sanctuary of peace. At least, that's what I permitted myself to think, cradled in a contentment I hadn't known in years. Thomas had one daughter, Caroline. She was 46, recently divorced, and established in the polished, fast-paced world of Boston. She was undeniably intelligent, impeccably dressed, and possessed an almost unnerving degree of self-control. Her every movement, every carefully chosen word, seemed to emanate from a place of precise calculation. When we first met, her embrace was light, fleeting, a choreographed gesture, perfectly executed yet devoid of any genuine warmth. It was a societal formality, not an expression of welcome. "I'm glad Dad isn't alone anymore," she stated, her voice smooth and even. Her words, on the surface, sounded gracious, thoughtful. Beneath the veneer, I felt an instantaneous chill. They weren't. The initial few months after our marriage maintained a veneer of cordiality. Caroline visited most weekends, making the drive from Boston. We cooked together in the sun-drenched kitchen, our conversations polite and superficial. We shared bottles of wine on the expansive deck, watching the sunsets paint the sky over the harbor. I tried genuinely to connect, but then, almost imperceptibly, the subtle shifts began. Thomas would start mentioning things I had supposedly said, his brow furrowed with a mild confusion that tore at me more than outright accusation would have. "You told Caroline you were worried about the cost of maintaining the house," he'd inquire, his tone carefully neutral. I hadn't. The thought had never crossed my mind. I loved the house. "And didn't you ask her what would happen to the property taxes if we decided to sell?" I didn't. We hadn't even entertained the idea of selling. Each comment on its own was small, reasonable even in the context of a new stepdaughter becoming acquainted with her father's new wife. They were easy to dismiss as misunderstandings, perhaps a slight misinterpretation on Caroline's part. Yet, repetition is an insidious and powerful thing. And doubt, once meticulously introduced, behaves like moisture seeping into untreated wood. Slow, silent, relentless. It warps the grain, weakens the foundation, until, almost without warning, the entire structure begins to buckle. The first unequivocal sign that something was gravely amiss occurred during a quiet dinner in late August. The evening air was still warm, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in through the open windows. Caroline, after a moment of carefully timed silence, placed her wineglass down with a delicate click, her gaze fixed on her father. She spoke with an alarming nonchalance. "Dad, have you given any more thought to protecting your assets? At your age, cognitive decline can happen quite quickly, you know." The very air in the room seemed to congeal, thick and heavy. A palpable tension descended, chilling the convivial atmosphere of our dinner. Thomas stiffened almost imperceptibly, his fork clattering softly against his plate. "I'm fine," he said, his voice clipped. "I know," she replied, her tone softening to an almost cloying gentleness, her smile a practiced curve. "But Linda has been asking a lot of financial questions lately. I just want to make sure everything is secure, for your peace of mind." My fork, laden with roasted salmon, froze mid-air, a silent witness to the calculated blow. The insinuation hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. "I haven't asked anything," I interjected, my voice surprisingly steady, "that your father and I haven't already discussed together." Caroline's smile widened, soft, patient, undeniably patronizing. It was the smile of someone who believed they held all the cards. Of course, that word again. A seemingly benign, innocuous word, yet in her mouth, it became a dismissive, subtly undermining weapon. Of course. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated with chilling predictability. The atmosphere in the house became charged with unspoken accusations. Thomas, his confidence visibly eroding, began double-checking decisions we had already made in unison, his eyes often carrying a flicker of suspicion. "Did you call the bank yesterday about the transfer? Why were you looking at my old tax files in the study?" I hadn't even entered his study that day. One particularly unsettling afternoon, I returned home from grocery shopping to find a folder lying conspicuously on the kitchen table. Inside were neatly arranged printouts from various websites, all detailing the ominous subject of elder financial exploitation. The headlines screamed of predatory spouses and manipulative caretakers. Thomas stood by the window, his back to me, gazing out at the harbor. He didn't turn when I entered. "Caroline is concerned," he said carefully, his voice hollow. "She thinks you might be influencing me." The word influencing did not just hang between us. It suffocated the very air, coiling like a toxic cloud. I felt something far colder and deeper than mere anger. I felt a profound, searing betrayal. Not because he voiced the accusation that was Caroline's doing, not his, but because he didn't immediately, unequivocally, dismiss it. Because the doubt had taken root, watered by his own daughter, and he couldn't bring himself to defend me. That night, sleep was an elusive phantom. My mind raced, replaying every subtle glance, every carefully placed comment. Then, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, as the house groaned softly around me and the buoy bells chimed their lonely song, a stark, painful clarity arrived. Caroline wasn't attempting a direct, frontal assault. That would be too messy, too easily disproven. No, she was far more strategic. She was methodically constructing a narrative. The narrative of the subtle, responsible, deeply concerned daughter, vigilant against a potential threat to her vulnerable, elderly father. Plant enough seeds of doubt, I realized, and eventually, someone else will come along and water them, nurturing them into full-blown suspicion. From that moment, I ceased reacting emotionally. The hurt, the anger, the disbelief, I pushed them down, replacing them with a cold, clear resolve. I started documenting. Caroline, I remembered, preferred emails when discussing what she deemed important matters. She understood the power of a paper trail, of putting things in writing. She didn't realize I did too. My years as a counselor had taught me the undeniable weight of objective record-keeping. When she suggested moving certain accounts into joint oversight, ostensibly for Dad's protection, I responded politely, agreeing to review the proposal, then saved every communication. When she implied in writing that I had requested access to Thomas's investment portfolio, a blatant fabrication, I asked her with unwavering calm to clarify her claim, to specify when and where I had made such a request. Confident in her written advantage, she doubled down, reiterating her false assertion. That, I understood with a quiet certainty, was her fundamental mistake. She had underestimated me. The true breaking point, the moment the carefully constructed facade finally shattered, came in early October. Thomas received a call from his longtime attorney, a man whose discreet professionalism he had trusted for decades. "Caroline, The attorney explained, had requested a private consultation. The subject, possible undue influence over her father. Thomas told me that evening, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He looked utterly defeated, as if the weight of the entire ordeal had finally crushed his spirit. "I don't know what to think anymore," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The confusion was heartbreaking. I reached across the dinner table, my hand finding his, covering it gently. His skin felt cool and fragile. "Then let's stop thinking separately," I said, my voice firm yet gentle. "Let's go together." The meeting took place in the attorney's wood-paneled office, a room that smelled faintly of old books, polished leather, and strong, dark coffee. The atmosphere was somber, heavy with unspoken tension. Caroline arrived, meticulously composed, her posture perfect, a sleek leather portfolio tucked confidently under her arm. She radiated an aura of controlled professionalism, a woman convinced of her righteous cause. She spoke first, her voice a calm, measured balm. "I'm just trying to protect my father. That's all this is." The attorney, a man with shrewd, knowing eyes, nodded slowly, his expression impassive. I waited. My turn would come. When it did, I simply slid a single, unassuming binder across the highly polished desk. It landed with a soft, decisive thud. Inside were the printed emails, each meticulously time-stamped. Messages detailing Caroline's initial fabrications, followed by my calm, fact-based responses. Documented corrections of her claims, devoid of emotion or accusation. Clear contradictions laid bare in black and white. No histrionics, no shouting, just facts. Undeniable objective truth. The attorney, his expression unreadable, read silently, his eyes scanning each page, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence stretched, thick and profound, punctuated only by the rustle of paper. Finally, he closed the binder and turned his gaze directly to Caroline. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of irrefutable logic. "These communications, Miss Whitaker, suggest that you introduced and then escalated concerns about financial manipulation without presenting any verifiable evidence whatsoever." Caroline's composure, once so unyielding, cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but visible nonetheless. A flash of something akin to panic flickered in her eyes. "I had reason to be worried," she insisted, a brittle edge to her voice. "What reason?" The attorney pressed, his gaze steady, unwavering. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. It hung in the air, damning in its emptiness. Caroline had no reason, only assumption and avarice. Thomas, who had been sitting quietly, almost hunched, slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at his daughter then, truly looked as if seeing her, really seeing her, for the very first time in his life. The realization, a bitter taste, spread across his features. "You were preparing to have her removed from decisions," he said quietly, his voice devoid of anger, simply stating a painful truth. Caroline's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching visibly. The elegant mask had fallen. "I was protecting what's ours," she retorted, her voice sharp with a sudden, exposed defensiveness. Thomas's voice, though still quiet, hardened with an unexpected, steely resolve. He had found his ground again. "It's not yours. It's mine." The room went profoundly still. The air crackled, not with fury, but with the shock of a truth finally acknowledged. There was no dramatic explosion.
No shouting, no tears, no theatrical accusations.
Just a quiet, undeniable recalibration of reality. The tectonic plates of their family had shifted. Thomas updated his legal directives that very week. Not, notably, to exclude Caroline entirely. He was not a vindictive man, but to establish neutral, third-party oversight for all significant financial matters. Transparency, boundaries, structure. Caroline stopped visiting for a while. The silence, initially jarring, slowly became a welcome quiet. Winter came early that year to coastal Maine, painting the landscape in shades of white and gray. One evening, As the first significant snowfall gathered in soft drifts along the shoreline, Thomas sat beside me by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm glow on our faces. "I should have trusted you immediately," he said, his voice imbued with regret. I shook my head gently, reaching for his hand again. "Fear is incredibly persuasive," I replied, staring into the mesmerizing dance of the flames, "especially when it comes from family, and when it's cloaked in the guise of concern." He studied the mesmerizing flames for a long, reflective time, processing not just the past few months, but perhaps an entire lifetime of assumptions. "I don't want suspicion living in this house," he finally declared, a quiet resolution in his tone. "It won't," I said, my grip firm on his hand, "because it couldn't. Not anymore." The venom had been purged. I never felt victorious, not in the triumphant, gloating sense. Only steady, grounded, resolute. There's something profound that people often fail to grasp about women in their 50s and 60s. We are past the age of proving our worth, of striving for external validation, of fighting every battle that comes our way. We are, above all else, protecting our hard-won peace. Caroline had genuinely believed she could unseat me, undermine my position, by simply sounding reasonable, by presenting herself as the voice of concerned logic. She mistook composure for substance. But integrity doesn't shout its presence from the rooftops. It waits patiently, keeps records meticulously, and when the time comes when it is truly necessary, it speaks clearly and often only once. And that, as I discovered, is entirely enough.